Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going deep into Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Oh, yeah.
It's a classic for a reason.
Right.
We're going to break down his strategies for getting people on your side, not talking about manipulation here, more about understanding what makes people tick.
Yeah, what's fascinating about Carnegie is that he really studied this stuff. Like, he didn't just make it up. He looked at all sorts of people. Business tycoons, historical figures like Lincoln, even opera singers. Those are some temperamental folks.
Right, and he starts off with a pretty bold statement. You can't win an argument.
Oh, really?
Kind of goes against everything we think we know, right?
Yeah, I mean, arguing, it's
Yeah,
practically a national sport.
exactly. So what's he getting at there?
Well, Carnegie believed that going head-to-head rarely gets you what you want. He tells this story about a tax expert in London. This guy needed information from a government official. Now, this official was known for being stubborn as an ox.
Oh, no.
So instead of arguing, the expert tried something different. He expressed real appreciation for the official's knowledge, for his years of experience.
Interesting strategy. But isn't there a risk there of coming across as like fake? How do you walk that line between genuine appreciation and just, laying it on too thick?
It's a good point. But it's really about recognizing that expertise, acknowledging their value, in this case, the expert's respect. It completely disarmed the official. And he got the information he needed. It all comes back to that basic need. Everyone wants to feel important. Everyone wants to be heard.
That's so true. And it makes me think, how often when someone tells you you're wrong, do you actually change your mind? Not very often, right?
Nope. It usually just makes a dig in your heels even more.
Yeah, makes you want to argue your point even harder.
Exactly. And that leads to Carnegie's next principle. Always show respect for the other person's opinions. Never tell them flat out they're wrong.
Okay, but what about those times when someone's just plain wrong, like objectively wrong? Should we just let it slide?
Well, Carnegie wouldn't advise that. He actually suggests something pretty surprising. Admit your own mistakes quickly and emphatically.
So lead by example. Show a little vulnerability first.
Yeah, kind of. He tells this funny story about himself. He got caught breaking the leash law in a park with his dog.
Oh, no.
And instead of making excuses, he just admitted it right away to the officer.
And what happened?
The officer was totally disarmed. He gave Carnegie a warning and let him go. Now imagine if he'd argued or tried to justify himself. Things probably would have gone very differently.
Right, so even when we mess up, owning up to it can actually work in our favor. It's like de-escalating the situation before it blows up.
Exactly. Instead of fighting fire with fire, you're redirecting the energy.
I like that.
And that brings us to Carnegie's next principle. It builds on this idea of redirecting force. He says, a drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall.
Okay, I love that. But give me an example. What does that actually look like in the real world?
One of Carnegie's best examples is John D. Rockefeller Jr. and how he handled a group of striking coal miners.
Oh, wow, that's a tough situation. A lot of tension there.
It was, but instead of coming down hard on them, he visited the miners' homes, he met their families, he expressed genuine appreciation for their work.
Huh, sounds like a politician working the crowd.
Well, he was definitely politically savvy, but there was also real sincerity in his approach. He focused on their shared goals, like wanting families to be safe and taken care of. And this approach, it calmed things down and got those miners back to work.
So it's about finding that common ground, building rapport, showing empathy, even when things are tough.
Exactly. And that leads us to one of Carnegie's most famous principles. Always make the other person feel important.
That's a good one. But isn't that something we should be doing anyway, regardless of whether we're trying to win them over?
Absolutely. But Carnegie highlights it because it's a fundamental human need, one that we often overlook. He tells this story about a woman who gave a Packard car. That was a luxury back then.
Wow, yeah, to a relative, simply because he appreciated her possessions and memories.
It wasn't about the material value at all. It was about making her feel seen, making her feel valued.
You know, it makes me think, have I made anyone feel truly important today? Have I really listened? Made them feel heard?
That's a great question for all of us to ask, and it leads perfectly into Carnegie's next principle. Become a good listener. Let the other person do a great deal of the talking.
Oh, this is where I struggle. I love to talk. It takes real effort for me to truly listen.
It does. Carnegie himself loved to talk, too, and he shares this funny story about how he accidentally became the most interesting conversationalist at a dinner party.
How did he do that?
By simply listening intently to a botanist talk about plants.
Wow, so he didn't actually say much at all.
Not really, but his genuine curiosity, his engagement, it made that botanist feel like the most fascinating person in the room.
So it's not about being silent. It's about active listening, showing genuine interest
Exactly.
in what the other person has to say. And that takes effort.
It def-
But it's worth it, because when someone feels heard, They're more likely to open up, more likely to connect with you, and that's where real influence begins.
Absolutely. And that ties right into Carnegie's next principle. First, arouse in the other person an eager want.
Okay, now this is starting to sound like sales tactics, persuasion. How do you make someone want something? Especially if they're not into to begin with. Isn't that kind of manipulative?
Carnegie actually addresses that. He says it's not about tricking people into wanting things they don't need. He tells this story about a little boy who didn't want to go to kindergarten,
Aw, kindergarten's fun though.
right? But then he saw how excited his family was about the finger painting they were doing, and suddenly he wanted to go too.
So it's about tapping into those existing desires, showing how your idea can help them get what they already want.
Exactly. Like that boy, he already wanted to be creative, and finger painting was trying to do that.
Right, you're not creating the desire out of thin air. You're just connecting your idea with something that's already there.
And that enthusiasm, it's contagious.
But sometimes enthusiasm isn't enough. Sometimes you need more than just words.
Absolutely. Carnegie was a big believer in dramatizing your ideas.
Oh, I like that. So like showing, not just telling.
Yeah, exactly. He tells this story about a cash register salesman. Instead of just talking about the benefits, he threw a handful of pennies on the floor,
During his sales pitch?
right in the middle of it.
Wow, that's a visual. Makes you pay attention.
It does.
But what about for more abstract ideas, things that are harder to visualize?
Well, even then, you can make them more compelling. Through storytelling metaphors, analogies. Think about the best presentations you've seen. They don't just rely on dry facts and figures. They use vivid language, powerful imagery, engaging narratives.
It's like that saying, facts tell, but stories sell.
Exactly.
A good story can make an idea stick, make it relatable.
And speaking of appealing to human nature, Carnegie's final principle taps into another powerful motivator, the appeal of a challenge.
Ooh, I love a good challenge. Tell me more.
Carnegie tells this story about Charles Schwab, the steel magnate. He wanted to boost productivity at one of his mills, but instead of threats or lectures, he did something much more subtle.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
At the end of the day shift, he walked into the mill and wrote a big number 6 on the floor.
Just a 6. What was that about?
The 6 represented the number of heats the day shift had produced.
Ah, so like a score.
Exactly. That night, the night shift saw that 6, and they were determined to beat it.
Of course, it's a challenge.
They ended up producing 10 heats.
Wow, so it was like a silent competition, appealing to their pride.
Their competitive spirit.
And it worked.
It did. People are often more motivated by intrinsic factors, like a sense of accomplishment, or a desire to outperform others.
Than by extrinsic rewards or punishments. It's so interesting, so much of what we've talked about today, it goes against our natural instincts. When someone disagrees with us,
We want to argue,
when we're wrong, we want to make excuses.
right? But Carnegie's saying these are the very things that hold us back from achieving our goals, from building strong relationships.
So it's like a whole new way of thinking, a new way of interacting with the world.
It is a shift, but a powerful one. It's not about being passive or a pushover. It's about understanding human nature and using that knowledge strategically.
Like learning a new language, the language of influence and persuasion.
I like that. But it's a language rooted in empathy and understanding, not manipulation or coercion.
Exactly. And like any new language, it takes practice. Conscious effort to become fluent. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today in this deep dive into Carnegie's principle.
We have.
But let's be real. We're all human. We make mistakes. We get defensive. We forget to listen. So how do we actually put these principles into practice in our everyday lives, especially in today's world where everything moves so fast?
That's a great question, and one that Carnegie himself addressed. What's remarkable is that even though he wrote this book decades ago, the principles he outlined, they're timeless. They're universally applicable.
Yeah, it feels like a real shift in thinking.
It is.
Like rewiring our brains to approach things in a whole new way.
And one key takeaway from Carnegie that can help with this shift is understanding that criticism. It's rarely effective.
Wait, so I should never criticize anyone. Isn't feedback important, especially at work?
There's a difference between constructive feedback and just tearing someone down. Carnegie pointed out that harsh criticism, it almost never changes anyone's mind. It just makes them defensive, less receptive to what you're trying to say.
So what's the alternative? If we see a problem, shouldn't we point it out?
It's all about how you approach it. Instead of attacking the person, focus on the issue, express your concern, acknowledge their perspective, and then work together to find a solution.
That makes sense. And it ties back to what we were talking about before, making others feel important. If you make someone feel valued, respected, they're going to be more open to hearing what you have to say.
Exactly. Carnegie actually highlights Abraham Lincoln as a master of handling criticism.
Oh, yeah. During the Civil War.
He was under immense pressure, constant criticism, but instead of lashing out, he really tried to understand where his critics were coming from, Find that common ground.
He also said, don't criticize them. They are just what we would be under similar circumstances.
Such a powerful quote. It really captures that empathy, that understanding that Carnegie was all about.
And that leads to another important takeaway, giving sincere appreciation. Okay, but what does that actually look like? I mean, it's more than just saying, good job, right?
It is. It's about being specific, genuine. Instead of a generic compliment, acknowledge something specific, an action or a quality you appreciate. Carnegie said everyone craves appreciation, recognition. It's a basic human need, and when we give it sincerely, it has a ripple effect. It impacts not just the recipient, but ourselves as well.
This reminds me of that story Carnegie tells about a Dutch immigrant. As a boy, he used to leave these inspirational notes for the people he delivered groceries to. Years later, he became a successful businessman.
And he reconnected with some of those people, and they were so touched by his kindness.
By those simple gestures from all those years ago,
It shows you the impact, that sincere appreciation.
those little things can make a big difference.
They really can.
So we've talked about reframing criticism, giving sincere appreciation. Any other key takeaways we should remember?
One of the most practical things Carnegie talks about is remembering people's names.
Oh gosh, I'm terrible with names. It's so embarrassing sometimes.
You're not alone. But Carnegie says it's so important. Remembering and using someone's name, it makes them feel important, respected. He even suggests some techniques for improving your memory, like repeating the name several times during a conversation or associating it with a visual image.
Okay, I'm going to try that. Any other tips?
One of the most profound insights from the book, and maybe the most counterintuitive, is the best way to influence people is to talk in terms of their interests, not yours.
So not pushing your own agenda, but understanding what they care about.
Exactly. Finding that common ground where your interests align. Carnegie tells this great story about Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate. He was trying to convince George Pullman, the guy who invented the Pullman sleeping car, to merge their businesses.
Makes sense. Two big names in industry.
At first, Andrew focused on the logic, the financial benefits, but Pullman wasn't buying it.
So what did he do?
He changed his approach. Instead of focusing on his own goals, he started talking about what Pullman cared about: recognition, legacy. He appealed to Pullman's desire to have his name and invention remembered.
Smart.
And that's how the Pullman Palace Car Company was born.
Wow. So by aligning his proposal with Pullman's desires, he was able to achieve his own goal. A win-win.
Exactly.
There's so much wisdom in this book. It's really about so much more than just winning friends and influencing people. It's about building relationships, becoming more persuasive, and ultimately living a more fulfilling life.
I think that's a great way to put it. Carnegie's principles, they encourage us to shift our perspective from self-centered to more empathetic and understanding. It's about genuine connections, mutually beneficial relationships.
So next time I'm in a disagreement or I need to get someone on board with an idea, I'm going to ask myself, how can I make this person want to see things my way? Because, like Carnegie said, arouse in the other person an eager want. That's where true influence begins.
That's a great takeaway. Influence isn't about manipulation or forcing people to do what you want. It's about understanding, connecting with others on a deeper level.
Thanks for joining us today on this deep dive into the wisdom of Dale Carnegie. Until next time, 8TOA.